So next, with this backdrop of this special moment in history, let's take a brief summary. Take a look at a brief summary of the agenda that we'll be going over today. The first is understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all that that entails. So we'll kind of touch on some key factors for you to see if your organization is indeed inclusive. There are examples to get you to think about your organization and where you guys might be at the current moment. Um, the next topic that we'll discuss are the challenges and building an inclusive workplace, um, and what those success rates and success factors look like. We will touch on why DEI matters and what the priorities of your next 12 months should kind of look like. And we will finish by talking about our ACT process, which is our proven steps for a more inclusive workplace. So, is your workplace inclusive? Let's take a quick look just to, like I said, these are examples, and we're just asking you to think about if you have a workplace that is inclusive. A lot of this, you'll see if you maybe have the majority of all of these to check off, then it's more than likely you do have an inclusive workplace. If you are taking a look at these, and there's some areas of improvement as well, then maybe you just have a little bit more work to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have an inclusive workplace. But a lot of this is tailored to finding out if you do have these kind of embedded in the DNA of your workspace. And share in the chat what you do well from this list, or what you can recognize as an area of improvement as well. Like I said, a lot of us in 2020 are just kind of starting on the big initiative for DEI. So it doesn't matter where you are, and we can all learn from each other and see what we do well and don't do well. All right, so take a look at these definitions. This gives you more of a context to level set all of us on the specific definitions on each of the terms we hear. So the difference between inequality and equity. What is an inclusion, and beyond that, a sense of belonging. So taking a look at these definitions, we hear them every day, but do we exactly know what they mean, and do we exactly know what they represent in our workspace? What attributes, this is little Danny again, which attributes of your workplace correspond to each? And we'd love to hear and love to see that in the chat. So kind of just not checking the box, but understanding what these exactly mean, like I said. With definitions, we say words all the time, but we exactly drill down to what they mean in every aspect of it. So that's great. And looking at here, we'll have some answers coming in. So, like I said, which attributes of your workplace correspond to each? We'd love to hear that in the chat as well. All right. So for the next part of our agenda, we're going to talk about those, challenges of building an inclusive workplace, and talking about those success rates and those success factors. Looks like we do have some more coming in. So we'll talk about that. We're diverse at the lower levels, but not diverse nor inclusive at the upper levels. Don't feel bad in that, because we see a lot of that, and we're trying to correct that as well. It's so much easier to focus on kind of those entry level positions, but not necessarily moving that talent towards senior leadership. So that is a pretty common one that we do see.
Okay, I think we have a lot of good input coming in. We will share some of the summary of these in the future. Thanks a lot, Eric, for getting us off to a great start. So um, I get to now be the bearer of a bit of bad news and talk about the challenges. For those of you who just joined, I'm Sonia Sapaban. Good afternoon and good morning. But don't worry, right after the challenges, we're going to spend most of the rest of this about solutions. The reason we talk about challenges up front is that we want to acknowledge up front that this is hard work. And from what's in the chat already, we can see that a lot of you are working on it, but it's not without its challenges. I had personal experience as a business leader trying to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in my organization for over a period of span of 6 to 7 years. And what I found is similar to what many of you probably have found, and what the BCG reports show that we're going to show here on the next slide. So they found that of the companies they talked to, and I think they talked to about 1,600, that over 97% of them had DEI efforts ongoing, but only 25% are actually successful. So this is, of course, really disappointing. But again, this reality is out there. So it's not really lack of effort. There is a lot of good effort going on, but it's not necessarily successful. And so that's what we're going to really focus on, is what are those success factors. But let's first talk about the challenges just for a moment more to make this real for you. We have one of these other kind of lists here on these slides that we share. We share this to give you kind of like thought joggers, right? What are your challenges? What do you see right now as you're trying to do some of this good work? If you don't mind taking just a couple of minutes to put it into the chat. Thank you for somebody explaining that BCG is the Boston Consulting Group. Yeah, they do a lot of great work, and they actually put a lot of reports out. The report that I'm speaking of, they put out year after year. The latest one is the 2019 one. But please put a little bit about what are some of these challenges. These are just examples. I see some people already sharing, knowing what to measure, engaging the whole organization, absolutely. Again, knowing what to measure. We're working on on strategic planning now, but we're having trouble identifying metrics. Limited resources and not having realistic metrics. Yes, I know that one. A lot of us get really, it's pretty stressful role, right? I think this is one of the most stressful roles in an organization. Unrealistic expectations and giving a part-time role to someone to, make it all better. Again, we see limited resources, engaging the whole organization, knowing what actions is tough, trying to get everyone to take steps collectively and clarifying what the impact will be. Again, knowing what to measure. So a lot of these are common, right? What we find, and please continue to put it in there. Again, we will share a summary of this afterwards, of course, without attribution. So please don't worry about that. So let's look at what the success factors are. So we have found that across a lot of customers and a lot that we have been working with, but also reports that have been out there, very authoritative, again, like Deloitte, like BCG, that access to expertise and adequate resources is the #1 issue. While there are experienced professionals out there, many times the DEI role, again, is part-time or is an added task, on top of a full-time job already. And the budgets are typically not enough. According to Russell Reynolds, I remember one metric is 53% of the D&I leaders are part-time. And of course, they're talking to the Russell 3000 companies. And again, most of them say that they don't have enough budget authority. The second one, a lot of you have said it already, is knowing where to focus and what to measure. 67% of all organizations, according to PeopleSoft, say that they don't know what to measure for DEI. Or if they measure a few things, they lack relevant benchmarks for their industry so that they can see where they're positioned. Representation, for example, in terms of gender representation, is very different in a tech engineering organization versus a retail. for example, industry. So it is important to have relevant benchmarks. And then last but not least, the third one here that you see is to build an inclusive culture. You need alignment and engagement. Again, you mentioned this, some of you here in the chat. Engaging everybody is very, very important, because that's what culture is. If you're trying to build an inclusive culture, is when you change behavior and you cause, a majority of the people to make decisions and to behave in certain ways. So when engagement is low, that's a big problem. In fact, as you know, as most of you know, I'm sure, Gartner reports that engagement is still only at about 33%. It's only improved about 5% in the last 20 years. So they've been following this and reporting on broad levels of engagement across organizations. And this is, again, pretty disappointing news. So we see Danny here again. So please, again, share in the chat which of these success factors you have already, you think is in place for you, or you're missing in your organization. Let's just get a little sense of where all of you are. Some of you may be advising or consulting others, or you may be yourselves leading some organizations. So please share really quick, between these three, having expertise, having budget, knowing where to focus, and alignment and engagement. Some of it relates to what you all said again on the previous chart that we asked about. I see having senior leaders having experience. That's certainly one of the issues. All right, so let's now talk about now that we know what the key ingredients are, let's talk about the process, a proven process that can give you results. Now, I know talking about process doesn't sound very exciting, but believe me, after trying for several years, and not really achieving, and what's worse, not having sustainable results in terms of, once a key leader is gone, what happens to the improvements that maybe have been made. I can tell you that this process thing can be pretty exciting to me if it gives me results, right? So that's why we talk about the challenges up front, because, like everything else, everything important that you're trying to do in an organization, process is everything. And so while it may not sound exciting, we're going to try and make it as exciting as we can here. Again, I see some inputs coming in about, strategies that may be created from the top, but there's minimal engagement from employees. That's exactly right. Or even, I would even say, even at the next level after the top leader, a lot of times it just sometimes stops there. We have input about, again, senior leadership is aligned with the DEI objectives at one organization here on input. That's awesome. That's very important. So let's talk a little bit about this process and what we mean when we talk about this ACT process. ACT is an acronym, of course. It stands for Align, Connect, and Transform. You can see some simple actions to take throughout this process here under each of these boxes. And that's why it's called the ACT process also, other than being a cute acronym. It also really stands for taking action, specific actions, because a lot of these generalities are known conceptually, frankly. I don't think there's any big revelations. As they say, the devil is always in the details. It's how do you go about implementing some of this? And that's what we're going to talk about and share some examples. And after this webinar, that's why we share our contact information. We really look forward to hearing from you about some of your own experiences, or where you may have questions or need any help. We have a DEI Institute, and we do a lot of research and benchmarking and so on. So we're always happy to share some of that and also to add to the body of knowledge. But as you'll see here, one thing I want to point out on this chart is the order is very important. That's what we'll talk about. In what order should you do these things? You can't just start engaging and connecting everybody. For example, what we do in the connect phase, before you do that hard work up front of aligning and understanding why and what and the how. So I would just want to point out the reason we call it a process is because it is important the order in which you do these things. So let's go ahead and see about this first step of it, align. So what's align? The objective here, as the name says, is to get alignment across your leadership and through the organization. Now, we all know leadership commitment is important, but how does that manifest itself to drive action? We see a lot of top leaders, especially in recent times, have put out a lot of great statements out there, and that's all good. I think it's important to put a statement out. And they are genuinely interested in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization, improving the workplace culture. But what's really important is that, is the active personal engagement in some visible ways. An example, for example, especially right now with COVID and all of us, seeing each other on video all day long, at our homes, is for leaders to share a bit about their home life and their family. This is something we have never done before, especially in, I would say, in American business. It's like you leave, your home life at home. Recently, as an example, there was a CEO of one of the big tech companies in the Bay Area, and there was a staff meeting. And the story is told that one of his kids ran up and sat on his lap. He calmly explained to his staff that his son needed some attention at that moment and asked if it would be all right if the kid, kept sitting on his lap as they were conducting the staff meeting. Needless to say, this was a big hit. And people said it was the coolest thing they had seen him do in like a very long time. So this is really to say that, leadership and being a visible DEI sponsor, that's what it really means. It's beyond statements. Statements are good, but they're not enough. The second bullet here is, that this commitment has to extend to the next level. We see this as a very common issue. Surprisingly, we find that that's often missing. And we don't mean just one or two. It's like that whole next layer. Imagine if you were trying to build a culture of safety or quality. It wouldn't be, you would expect all of the business leaders to get around that. So one of the best ways, of course, for the CEO to make this real for the rest of the organization is to clearly link the key business drivers and the priorities that they're all working towards with the DEI objectives. And that is actually a big part of this align phase that we focus on. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. But all of it can't stop there. You can't just have the top leader and the next level getting together and coming up with some strategic initiatives and connecting it with DEI. That's all good, but as someone said earlier in the chat, a lot of times that stops there and employees are not engaged with any of that. So you have to listen for the voice of the employee. The voice of the employee is the new buzzword in the last few years. And by that, we don't mean just surveys. Again, surveys are good, they're great, but they're not enough because really when you do a survey, think about it, you only know what people are thinking about the very question you ask them at the very moment that they're answering that question. You don't know anything about the rest of their thinking. You may not have thought to ask them, some other things that are on their minds. And, tomorrow, a week later, or 6 months later, it may be very well different about how they feel about things, especially right now when there's so much uncertainty, there's so much happening. Every day we wake up and it seems like there's something new. So it is so important to have your finger on the pulse of the organization. So we always recommend, of course, in-person listening session and focus groups are great. Now, they're not hugely scalable, especially if you have a large organization. So we talk about in-house digital platforms for 24/7 communications. You want to be careful how you do that as well. There has been some backlash with some tools that are meant for business use, and people have said some things that had to do with diversity and inclusion or with workplace culture. There's an example of the Away luggage company. It's a very successful tech company that had this issue, and in fact, their CEO had to resign over an issue that occurred because of the communications digitally. So we want to be careful and do this right. We have a culture app that we use with our customers, but it's intended for this. So you need something that's really intended, and that it's a safe environment, and that there won't be some unexpected issues from it. I always feel like I need to say that as I encourage communications. Of course, it has to be done very thoughtfully when you do it on broad scale across your organization. Another key ingredient is sensing and assessing the infrastructure's maturity. What do we mean by this? I mean the policies, the processes, the benefits, the communication channels. Really, what's the culture, what your infrastructure is set up. And for this, there's different ways of assessing it. But a lot of times people say, okay, I can go and see if I have a policy or a process, but how do I really get a sense of how do I compare or how do I score that? We have a maturity model instrument. It provides 5 scores. It has some best-in-class benchmarks. So it's like a thermometer in these dimensions. So it's really important that no matter how you do it, but you get a sense of where you are with respect to these infrastructure aspects. Because, no matter how hard you work, for example, on diversity hiring, when a young mother joins your organization, the first thing they're going to look for is your maternity and paternity and family care policies. I remember when I was in my younger years, that was supremely important to me. When a millennial is going to join you, they look at the events you're holding, your communications, and what organizations you support or you're part of. So again, there's anecdotal information. You have to somehow get your arms around it so you can really get an assessment of it, somehow score it, and then watch it and kind of see as you change policies, as you do different things, as those scores progress, how does it impact the rest of the aspects of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know in the chat, there's been some information about, what are the metrics and how do you do that? Again, I do agree that this is one of the harder areas to measure, but there are certainly some ways to measure them. And we're happy to talk to you afterwards if there's a need for that. Last but certainly not least, once you create the alignment, you need to capture it in a plan. Listen, any important thing that is done in any organization has a plan for it, right? The plan makes it real. And as you, progress, that plan, of course, has to evolve. It's not one and done, right? So we always recommend like a 12-month plan, which is a living document. But it's absolutely needed. And it serves a great purpose beyond just the people that might use it for setting objectives. It really explains the why. The why is so important. It explains to everybody how the overall business drivers and strategic priorities relate to DEI. It kind of puts it in perspective. And that's what makes it sustainable. We did a lot of great activities in my own experience, and we have a number of, all of our team are people with really great experience, many years of experience in various aspects of DEI and having the HR background. And so we all know of those great initiatives and things that we put in place, and then they didn't last. We don't very often see a DEI plan that is focused on DEI, but it also is linked with the business plan and with the overall strategic plan of the organization. That's a critical link. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, is that a big part of this process is, that the aligned phase is the most important aspect of it, the first step of the process. And within the align, if you do all the great things, but you don't capture it in one plan or some way to kind of codify it and memorialize it and have people be able to go back to it, it will unfortunately have the issues of being a sustainable change. And then, of course, you have to keep it up to date and keep every 12 months or so at least updating it. So look at these 6 elements that we've shared here. Here's Danny again. I want you to take a moment and please take a look at these and share in the chat box which ones you have or may need to be working on. Do you have the alignment at the leadership level? Some of you have said earlier that you did. Do you have the next level? What about next level? How many of you just quick responses here on the chat, if you don't mind. What are some of the next level alignment that you see? Do you have a lot of alignment with the next level that is reporting to the CEO? So your CEO is all on board, let's say. Do you have it at the next level? Do you understand your maturity of your organization in terms of assessing the processes, policies, and so on? We're going to wait here for a bit so that we can get some feedback. There's an input here. Yeah, so the C-suite and VPs are on board. That's great for the most part. Yeah. Our mayor is the top visible leader. Yes, I think some may or may not agree with that. They hired someone says they hired a third-party consultant to come in to do a full DI assessment and help with infrastructure, strategy development, short-term and long-term plans. That's awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of, I know it's hard, but like everything else, there is professionals in this, in this field. And so it's okay to ask for help and to go outside. And a lot of this expertise is, you have to find it. As we said, one of the key success factors is expertise. So let's now talk about if you think about these aspects that you have to have in place. What are the first part of it? We said the key part that I asked you to please remember is that you need to link your DEI objectives with business priorities. So let's talk about business priorities first. Let's just start there. Can you share, this is just an example of a few items that might come to mind in terms of being some of the priorities for this coming 12 months. Of course, at the top of it is, how to be successful when we get kind of back to this new normal, right? That might be your priority. Or attracting and retaining talent, or expanding markets, expanding margins, improving your valuation and attracting new investors. So I know that a lot of you that have joined us have HR and DEI background, but how connected are you with the business priorities? Do you really understand? Are you really connected with the business priorities of your organization, and what might they be? These are just some thought joggers. So if you could all share in the chat a couple of ideas on what the business priorities are. Or do you just not have the foggiest? I hope that's not the case. So attracting and retaining good employees, increasing employee engagement. Yeah, absolutely. That's any organization is its people. So that's for sure a top one. How about some other ones? We had a lot of great input on challenges. So everybody it seems like challenges are up close and personal, but what about the business priorities? Really think about it for a moment. And again, as Eric said at the beginning, please jot these down for yourselves, because I think a day or two later, we go to these webinars and then we come out of it and we say, what did they really talk about? What did I get out of it? Was my time well spent? The thing that is nice is if you have a set of notes that you can go back to to jog your memory. So here we have some input on doubling and tripling revenue. Wow, yeah, that would be awesome. Of course, after this 2020, I guess a lot of people need to really do that. And we have another one, managing those that want to come back and those that want to stay at home. I think that's a really great input, because the future of work will never be the same again, right? And it will be hybrids in some way. Building new products and markets, yes, we all want to do that. Branding, becoming an accurate reflection of our community at all levels of the organization. That's really an awesome one. I think that's what Eric was talking about earlier when he talked about the national and really global historic moment. for many reasons in the U.S. Those of you who are in the U.S., I know we have some global participants here, and we appreciate that. We don't mean to be all American-centric, but it is true that, especially in this country, in the U.S., we've had a lot of different kind of challenges in recent times. So restoring everybody's faith, trust, and engaging at different levels, I think there's going to be a lot of more people demanding that. And then we have good input here. Women have left the workforce 4 times as much as men. I know it's a very sad thing. So partly job loss and partly leaving to care as caregivers. Top priority should be getting this talent back into the workforce, so companies don't lose their investment in it. I absolutely agree with that. So these are really great inputs. Again, we'll share back a summary of these so we can all take advantage of it. These are really serious issues, right, that we all are dealing with. So let's just talk for a moment at the business case, the types of business priorities that a lot of your companies might have at a high level. What you want to do is, once you've determined the business priority, all of the good ones that you just shared, you want to then relate it to how does DEI help that, right? This, I guarantee you, we have seen it across countless customers. We put that hard work in at the beginning to identify what those business priorities are and then to link it with DEI, that you absolutely get a sustainable and a very successful program. So here are some of those top business priorities and how they relate to DEI. As you can see, a lot of these are very well documented in, again, very authoritative sources. And we see it really across organizations, regardless of their industry and size, that they have one or more of these priorities in mind. So again, there's clearly a business case. And I want to just say to all of you, congratulations. You've just completed your first step in getting alignment in your organization, as you this process of starting to think about what are the business priorities and then how it might relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion is really the start of that. Okay. So let's now jump into the second step. You remember there was 3 steps, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about the align phase. Now we're going to talk about the second letter in the ACT process, the connect. This is critical to do right after getting alignment when you approach DEI in order to make a sustainable change initiative. Culture, again, like we said, is a set of behaviors. So connecting and engaging the organization is the key. When this step is missed, you often end up with good numbers, lots of initiatives, but frankly, I won't mention names, but we have major companies that have made great progress. And if I mention their names, you say, oh, well, they're getting all the awards, right? Yes, they're getting all the awards and they've done great work. But they come to us after a lot of work and they say they've hit a plateau. And somehow their workplace just doesn't feel inclusive. And so the key step is, again, to start with the why. Sharing that critical link that was made between the business priorities and the DEI objectives and efforts. It helps, get things going. It helps for people to understand why it's a priority, why it's not just yet another thing to do or a checkbox, that it really is important to all of those key objectives they have. If they understand the business case, they understand that they're leaving a lot on the table if they don't focus on DEI as a key leverage point for getting those business priorities done. We always recommend starting with a small group of early adopters and champions to kind of spark for this engagement. They may be your DI council or ERG members, or they may be team members that everyone can relate to and see as rising stars and influencers if you don't have a DI council or an ERG. And this small group of champions and early adopters are the ones that start to communicate and spread the word about this why, what, and the how that is established in the align phase. One of our customers, for example, had manufacturing facilities. So we helped the early adopters come up with very cool posters around their facilities and send flyers to their homes and so on. We've done this at several facilities that are like this, where they have operations where people are really on the floor. And, and it's been very, it's been very effective. Another popular way, of course, especially now with COVID, is to create a safe digital environment, which also makes it easy for leaders to engage. Again, we have a culture app, so we have some data from that. We found that there is this thing, we call it a CEO effect. And what we mean is that if a CEO or a top leader that's equivalent to a CEO shares a personal experience, or even just replies or reacts to a post that's made by an employee, there's anywhere from like 2x to 10x impact on engagement of the rest of the organization. And that effect lasts. There's a tail to it. Just think of how amazing it is when we talked about engagement, sitting kind of not improving very much, at that 33% that Gartner is reporting. It takes only a few minutes on a cell phone, or on the desktop, just engaging and sharing. And it's really one of the most effective initiatives that can be undertaken to improve engagement. Training is, of course, also important in this phase. It gives leaders and champions not just the language and the basics, but more importantly, the confidence to communicate and be visible in their efforts. That's what we found is like a byproduct. It's a really cool thing. Last but not least in this phase, you want to keep the authentic conversations going. Again, this is not a one and done. Culture building has to be a commitment, a long-term commitment. And so I can't overemphasize that. Again, really quickly here, what are some of the unique aspects of your environment in the way that you think, that you might do some of these things, like engaging, connecting, educating and communicating in your environment? If you don't mind sharing again in a couple of moments here, that would be awesome. And I'm going to move. I see that there's a few things here that people are sharing. And then we tend to think that we have to solve our problems alone. That's right. Somebody is saying a lot of great input here. Again, we will summarize for you later. So now is the third. We're getting there. Just a couple more slides here, and then we'll have a few minutes hopefully at the end for questions as well. So get ready for questions that you want us to answer for Eric and myself here live. And we will. If you ask a question that we haven't responded to in real time, or someone else hasn't responded to in the chat, we're going to go back and we'll get back with you for sure. So, so rest assured, all your questions will be answered, whether you ask them right now or even afterwards if you reach out to us. So let me quickly cover this last step: transform. Now, transform is a big word, and we think of it as something drastic, or and some big thing that one day we say, oh, we got transformation today. It actually happens slowly and very gradually. It takes really sustained effort and ways to ensure that you're staying on track. So in this phase, measuring what matters, that's when it's at the top of the list. Now, notice I talked about order, right? The order of things is important. A lot of people do this first. Now, again, some measurement, some assessing is important at the beginning, but it can't just be your whole initiative. We talk to companies and we say, oh yeah, we've been measuring things for a long time. Well, that's great, but it's really only after the why, the what, and the how, after you've done the alignment phase, and after you've engaged everyone and heard from them as well, is when you really know what you should be measuring. Because you should measure what matters, right? And key performance indicators. People say, I don't know what to measure. A lot of people measure, of course, representation and compensation. Those are good things, but really it's well beyond that. We have identified 50 key performance indicators in 6 categories. And what's important, though, is to select a few from that. So going beyond representation and compensation, what's really important is, for example, KPIs that go across the whole hiring pipeline. From the very beginning of, when you start the pipeline, your target population, through the process of, selection, down selecting, interviewing, making an offer and hiring. For career growth and development, tracking metrics that apply to performance management, career advancement, sponsorship, mentorship, succession planning. To ensure progress, assigning accountability is also critical. Sometimes we hear that DEI is everyone's job. And yes, we fully agree with that. Let's let that be clear. But like anything else, again, like safety, quality, or frankly, profits and financial performance, while it's everyone's responsibility, like members of a good orchestra, you need a conductor and ways of making sure that collectively the organization is making progress towards achieving the right objectives. So you do need to assign accountability. We also recommend regular reviews, not separate reviews necessarily, preferably as part of the ongoing regular drumbeat of the organization. So again, take a moment and reflect on, what would be your KPIs if you were going to start? Now that you've thought a little bit about what your business priorities are and how DEI might relate to that, what frequency of reviews would make sense for you, and the results that you'd like to see. So I'll give it again a minute or actually a few seconds maybe for you to think about that. But meanwhile, let me also go on and cover this last slide that we have in the deck, just to give you very briefly, an example of really a case study. So as we said in the beginning, this process that we just described with the align, connect, and transform in that order, and in some of the ways that we described, it's really guaranteed to work. We have seen it with many clients. And here's an example of a manufacturing company, for example, that was focused on innovation, and they knew that for that they needed a diverse and inclusive organization, but they were having some issues around knowing what to measure beyond the basic metrics that they were doing, like representation and pay equity analysis, and really just having overall awareness, that despite the statements and some of the efforts, they were having trouble with that. They knew they had, a tough employee engagement issue. Even with the webcasts from the top leaders, they would only get like 10, 15%, maybe 20% tops. On the connect phase of the process, they saw their employee engagement increase to 60, 70% very quickly. And very soon they started hearing people throwing around terminology that was new, but very welcome around the workplace, like talking about empathy and curiosity about different types of cultural celebrations. All of a sudden they could feel that something is happening. Something was in the air that wasn't there before. And this was, again, because of that connect phase of the process. Also, when we started, they were mostly focused on entry-level diversity hiring. They went to HBCUs and did all those right things. And they had a decent representation when you looked at the organization as a whole for gender and racial diversity. But they were not measuring any other diversity dimensions, like disabilities, age, or veteran status. And they were not looking at it hierarchically through the organization structurally. So with the early assessment and alignment phase, they were able to identify a few gap areas that they started focusing on, like the structural diversity in management ranks and also on millennial hiring. And then they started seeing improvements really by just focusing on their internal performance assessment and career advancement processes, by applying some ways of attracting millennials, like cool ads in different outlets. So once they had that awareness, they understood where the real gaps were and where to go focus. And you see some of these metrics up here: 4 times engagement improvement, 3% increase in female manager representation, and the millennial. Those happen after really a few months. The last one is something they realized. They already had, they just didn't realize that in the veterans group, that they were twice as highly represented in management than in the general population. They were able to leverage that for branding and recruiting and so on, which really worked out nicely also. So this is really, I will wrap up here and say that we've gone through the process, the ACT process, of the Align, Connect, and Transform. It really is effective against the challenges that we talked about early on. And here is a case study. We have many more. Similarly, companies that sometimes, and organizations that are actually more traditional, find even more success compared to where they start from, as well as tech companies. We have small, large, all sizes. Really, the key is to have the leadership commitment, of course, and then to have this process and a methodology of going about it. So with that, I will pause and see. I think, Eric, maybe we could see if we could still answer a couple of questions. We only have a few minutes left, but if there are any questions that you would like to put in the chat, I also know that we have some questions that are already asked, so we could also look at some of the questions that have been asked.
Yes, I've taken a look at the chat box. If we did miss any of your questions, just please throw it back now. We want to answer with the time that we have left. I do see, Patricia, this is kind of a question for the group. She says, has anyone done any surveys where they separated responses from leadership and employees and found a big disconnect? So you can put that in the comments as well. I know that I've seen that in my past work history, and that's a large part in, where the breakdown is sometimes, because leadership has a different view and the employees have a different view. And what Sonia was talking about is that alignment and engagement. So you should have your leadership aligned with your DEI initiatives, and make sure that it's important to understand how the employees feel as well, because it has to be in the DNA of everything. It can't just be, like someone mentioned, it can't just be an HR initiative. It doesn't have to be just the DEI initiative. It has to kind of permeate through the entire organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that I have almost always found a disconnect. I'll go that far between the leadership perspective and the employee perspective, unless there has been really focus on getting that alignment and that engagement. That shrinks, that difference shrinks as some of what we talked about is done. There's one, do you recommend administering the maturity model to those two groups separately to address that issue? So let me explain about the maturity model. The maturity model that I described is really about the whole infrastructure, and it's pretty factual. So it is, at least our instrument is, I think most instruments, they have to be objective and kind of in order to be valid. But so it really doesn't matter who takes that one, because it's really about, do you have paternity or maternity? Now, you could sense for that and ask it the other way. I suppose you could. I hadn't thought about it, but in real time, I'm thinking it would be cool to ask the employees, do you think we have a policy for paternity or maternity? Because sometimes they don't. Sometimes their perception is not true. The company may have policies. We had one situation where on our culture app, an employee asked an LGBT member of LGBT community, asked their organization why they didn't have benefits for partners that were, same sex. And the company, of course, to their credit, they handled it very well and responded. And they did say that, well, in fact, they do have benefits as long as the partners are married, regardless of sexual orientation. That was something that the individual who asked didn't know, even though that was the case at their company. So I think there's a case that you could have the maturity model be taken by employees as well, but it's really intended to measure really what your basic infrastructure is. There's also employee experience surveys, of course, which then test for the employees specifically and what their perspectives are. I see that we're at the top of the hour. We're happy to hang out here another few minutes for those who want to ask any other questions. But this has been, we really appreciate your time spending it with Eric and myself. And Eric, any parting words?
No, if you could just move to the last slide.
Sorry about that, yes.
So yeah, like Sonia was saying, we're at the top of the hour. But if you have any questions or anything we weren't able to ask, or any, want to reach out for any assistance where we can help as well, there's my email and Sonia's email here. And we hope that, you've kind of seen what kind of rings true for other people. You're not alone in this journey, and a lot of people are doing the same things and trying to move forward. So we hope that you've able to kind of grab some information from this and think about your own journey. And like I said, just reach out to us if you have any questions or need any help.
Yeah, we look forward to talking to all of you at another time. And next year we'll have monthly webinars, so we will advertise about that. The first one is January 28th. So see you then, and have happy and safe holidays. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.